All right, class, welcome. Module 6, Great Depression and the New Deal. This will take us into kind of the pivot point, halfway point of the course, which is World War II. So, some guiding questions. How did the American economy change after the end of World War I? What were the causes of the Great Depression? There's no objective answer to that. It depends on your point of view. It's a subjective assessment. We'll get into that in a minute. How did the New Deal permanently and radically alter the relationship between Americans and their government? Similar to some previous things we've covered, the Progressive Era, the kind of rise of American imperialism, where we're getting involved in foreign affairs much more aggressively. And this is another example similar to those that, for better or for worse, this is a period where the federal government gets bigger and much more involved in the day-to-day life of American citizens. How effective was the New Deal at mitigating the effects of the Great Depression? Mitigating means to kind of limit the damage. Um, well, we'll get to that. It's also subjective. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder. The New Deal did not end the Depression. Um, but the defenders of it will argue that without the New Deal, the Depression would have been even worse. And that's what's called an unfalsifiable thesis. You can't prove a negative. We don't know what would have happened without the New Deal. You know, this isn't the multiverse. We have one reality that we went through here. So we know that the New Deal didn't end the Depression, but what we don't know is, did the New Deal prevent the Depression from being even worse? Again, we don't know. It's just a matter of your uh, political beliefs, fundamentally. So, in terms of how the economy changed after World War I, we covered earlier that during the war, there's this brief period where huge numbers of Americans enter the workforce really for the first time, specifically women and African Americans. Now, after the war ends, and all of the military age men, mostly white men, who fought in the war, after they come home, they're going to re-enter the workforce, and most of the newer workers, the women and the African Americans, for example, are going to be displaced. So there are big shocks to the labor market. The text points out that in 1919, the first full year after the end of the war, 1 in every 5 workers went on strike at some point in that year. That's wow. 20% of the entire workforce at some point in a single year being on strike. That is a very chaotic situation. So what caused the shocks to the labor market? I don't believe we've talked in this course yet about supply and demand. It is something that you need to understand. It is the most fundamental kind of first principle of economics and of many other things, honestly. Supply and demand. Supply is how much of something there is, demand is how valuable it is. I believe we covered this briefly when we talked about child labor being banned. Um, Supply is how much there is, demand is how much people want that thing, and price follows demand. The higher in demand something there is, the more expensive or valuable it will be. And generally speaking, when one of them goes up, the other one goes down. Not always, but usually. So the shocks to the labor market. Well, the supply of workers radically increased. Now, when we talked in the earlier context about ending child labor, the supply of workers in that case decreased, and therefore the demand or the value for workers increased, if you remember that, and people got raises after child labor was banned. Well, here we see the opposite. Here we see an increase in the supply of labor due to all the soldiers coming home and re-entering the workforce. And so if there's an increase in supply, Supply goes up, demand goes down. If you have a bunch of new workers entering the workforce, what's going to happen to the average pay? It's going to go down because each worker is in lower demand because the supply of them is higher. So very, very chaotic period. I believe this is the last of the Progressive Era amendments that we will talk about, the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. It made alcohol illegal. And then nobody drank ever again. You understand that's not how that works, right? So we talked about, the wisdom of this, victimless crimes in previous context. Uh, the effect of prohibition, or the prohibition of alcohol, was not, of course, that people stopped using that drug. It's that it went underground. Now it's a criminal enterprise. So that means a couple things. And you can think about this in the context of any drug. Alcohol, marijuana, if the government decided to make cigarettes illegal, uh, crystal meth, and any drug that people are going to want, whether it's legal or not, here's what happens if you make something illegal. Number one, the government now is no longer collecting tax revenue from that thing. Before Prohibition, the government, it was actually a big stream of revenue for the government was taxes on alcohol. Well, if you make something illegal, you can't tax it. So the government's losing money through that tax. And the government is spending money on going after people for alcohol. So they're losing money because they can't tax alcohol because alcohol is illegal, and they're spending money on law enforcement for something that didn't used to be a crime. So the government is losing money hand over fist here. That's one thing. The other thing is if legitimate legal businesses can't supply alcohol, who's going to do it? Well, organized crime. That shouldn't shock anybody. It's the same as with the drug cartels. You're going to make something illegal. All right, well, criminals are going to provide that thing. So one effect of prohibition, it enriched notorious gangsters such as Chicago's Al Capone. This led to the rise of the modern definition of organized crime. It dramatically increased the murder rate in this country because this is a very lucrative business, alcohol, and since it's now controlled by criminals, where do criminals adjudicate their business disputes? They don't go to court, they shoot it out in the streets. So, number one, government's losing money. Number two, the behavior they were trying to deter people drinking wasn't really that effective at that either. And it increased the crime rate, specifically violent crime. So maybe it was a good intention, didn't work out so great. Ultimately, I don't think we'll cover this specifically, but real quick, if you're wondering, well, wait a minute, alcohol is illegal? Obviously, it's not now, right? Um, that amendment was overturned in 1933, so it was in effect for about 16 years. One of the unique things about prohibition, about that amendment to the Constitution, well, there's two things I guess you might find interesting. Number one, there's a general point of view that amendments to the Constitution are usually designed to increase people's rights. So I'm trying to think of some we've talked about in this course. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment and the Reconstruction, ending slavery. That increased people's rights and freedoms by definition. Um, birthright citizenship, that increased people's rights. Giving African Americans, former slaves, the right to vote. It wasn't enforced, but on paper that increased people's rights. We talked about I think in the last unit, the women's suffrage, the amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. That increased people's freedoms, right? So usually amendments to the Constitution, at least on paper, are designed to expand freedom. Prohibition doesn't do that. Prohibition restricts a certain type of freedom. The other unique thing about the Prohibition Amendment is is the only amendment to our Constitution that has ever been passed and then later with a different amendment undone, overturned. That's hasn't happened before with any other issue, right? It's not as if, for example, the 13th Amendment was undone and slavery was reinstated, right? That doesn't happen. Once an amendment's in, it's in. Prohibition is the exception to that rule. National Origins Act of 1924, very timely issue. Immigration. It is a contentious issue now. That's not new. This has always been a contentious issue because this country has always been a country of immigrants. So there's always going to be this debate in this country. How many immigrants should be let in? From what countries? And for what reasons? How many? That's an important question. What country of origin, countries, plural, are we going to prioritize? And for what reasons? Do we only want doctors and engineers? Or do we want people fleeing persecution? What are we trying to accomplish, right? Is it a humanitarian gesture or is it more of what can benefit our country? There's a lot that goes into this. So this debate 100 years ago led to the National Origins Act. So in terms of country of origin, it limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, banned most immigrants from Asia, but it allowed unlimited immigration from the Western Hemisphere, from Central and South America. So there's a few things here. Why would the government ban? Because look, this is usually in the text portrayed as uh, a law, a policy that was driven almost entirely by racism. And you could certainly make that argument to for parts of this law, of course, but if it's purely about racism against non-whites, why is the first thing they're doing severely restricting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe? It's weird, right? Because Europeans are white, last time I checked. Well, here's why. Southern and Eastern Europe, as opposed to Northern and Western Europe, are much more Catholic. Southern Europe, think Italy. Eastern Europe, think Poland. This was about anti-Catholic sentiment, not about race. Banning most immigrants from Asia, that was surely about race. And it was also about concerns of cheap labor, especially from China, flooding the Western United States, supply and demands that would undercut wages for American citizens, natural born American citizens in California, for example. And unrestricted immigration from the Western Hemisphere and the rest of the Western Hemisphere south of the United States, as you know, is primarily non-white. So if this law is primarily motivated by white supremacy, you wouldn't have unlimited immigration from south of the border, right? That doesn't really fit. So it's a little more complex than that. There's racism involved, to be sure. There's also simultaneously some anti-Catholic sentiment to be involved, which is actually kind of contradictory because the huge majority of people in the Western Hemisphere south of the US are Catholic. And there's also concerns about labor, cheap labor. So here we go. Labor leaders, people that were in charge of unions back then, representing workers, argued that impoverished migrants lowered wages for American workers. That's what they argued. Um, that term argue usually implies that there is an argument, there is a debate, there are different points of view. This is an objective fact of economics. If you flood the country with low-skilled labor, you will lower wages for everybody else, period. There's no way around that reality. Now, that's not the question. The question is that you should consider, because this debate is happening right now, right? What is the primary responsibility of the American government? If it is to protect the welfare of American citizens, we should not be opening up the borders to large numbers of, how do they say, impoverished migrants. That goes against the interests, the economic interests of American citizens. It does. Now, on the other hand, though, what is our moral responsibility? Because not everything's about money, right? So what's our moral responsibility to allow poor, desperate people who want to improve the lives of their children? What's our moral responsibility to them as a country of immigrants versus our economic responsibility to the people that are already here? So that's a really important thing for you to assess. Congress heeded the pleas of employers who wanted cheap labor. Nothing new under the sun. That's still true. You know, a lot of people tend to think of big corporations, big employers as being conservative. And, you know, conservative is a loaded word and depends on what we're talking about, liberal, conservative, many variations of what those words even mean. But in terms of the immigration debate, big corporations, big employers are in favor of open borders because that leads to cheap labor. And that means employers save on labor costs and could theoretically increase their profit margins. So this debate here, economic interests versus moral interests, the interest of the employers versus the interest of the workers. That is not a new debate. This goes all back all the way throughout the history of our country. The 1920s brought a resurgence of the KKK. We talked about the Klan for the first time in the context of when they first emerged after the Civil War. This is the second time we will reference the Klan in this course. And then the third time will be during the Civil Rights era. So there's three waves, peaks of Klan activity in this country. One is after the Civil War as a resistance to Reconstruction. The other is 100 years later during the Civil Rights Movement as a resistance to the Civil Rights Movement. I would bet you're probably familiar with each of those. The third one, though, you might not be familiar with in the 1920s. Why did the Klan surge in the 1920s? What was going on? Well, some of the things we were just talking about. Um, the text points out an important point. Members did not limit their harassment to blacks, but targeted immigrants, Catholics, and Jews as well. So the Klan was a white supremacist organization, as you know, who targeted blacks for persecution and or outright physical violence up to and including murder. You know that. But it wasn't just blacks that they were going after. They were going after immigrants. Why? Because of what we just talked about. The Klan is an all-white group, obviously, which was centered in the South originally. There's not that many immigrants in the South. Never have been. Immigrants to this country during this period, I should stipulate. Now there are a lot of immigrants in the South. During this period, immigrants overwhelmingly went to the North or the West Coast, right? New York, Ellis Island, not Mississippi. Um, and they were concerned, the Klan, about certain groups that you might define as, quote, white, that they didn't look at as, quote, white. Catholics, they were very anti-Catholic. And that segues back to that, why would the government restrict immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe? Anti-Catholic bias. They define white as, there's an acronym WASP, WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. To be fully white, according to the Klan, you had to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. You had to be white, obviously, but Anglo-Saxon, English or German. That's shorthand for Northern or Western European. Again, Northern or Western European. And so they want to restrict Southern and Eastern Europeans. Why? Because Southern and Eastern Europeans tend to be Catholics. So in Jews, the idea that Jews are white, um, okay, there is a lot to be said for that whole history. Half of the Jews in the world are not white; they're uh, Arab, essentially. They're native to the Middle East. When you think of white Jews, you're thinking of the Jews that lived in Europe and then later America, the Ashkenazi Jews. And yes, they are physically, they appear to be white, but an equal number of Jews never left the Middle East, have always been in the Middle East, and they're what's called Sephardic Jews. They're Arab. Um, and so white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, Northern or Western Europe, and Protestant, not Catholic, Protestant. Okay. So as ridiculous as this sounds, the Klan, by their definition, would not define me as being white. Now, you haven't met me, but you can see me on the screen, right? I'm pretty white, but I'm Catholic. So according to the Klan, I'm not in the club, which good. I don't want to be in their club. So a lot of harassment aimed at blacks, of course, but other groups as well. In this photograph here, 1920s, look at this. Middle of Washington, D.C., middle of the day, hundreds and hundreds of people, Klan members, parading down the main thoroughfare in our nation's capital. Are they wearing hoods? Are they making any effort to hide their identity? No, no. This is wide open, out in the public. And the other thing I want to point out about the Klan activity during this period, it's not just the Deep South anymore. The Klan was very active in the Midwest. The Klan was very active in California. Klan was nationwide now because of something we covered previously, the Great Migration, where African Americans left the Deep South for the first time, moved in large numbers to, say, Detroit, Michigan. And what do you know? All of a sudden, there's a big Klan presence in Michigan. So this is the peak of the Klan's power. Now, in terms of the Great Depression, how did it happen? Why did it happen? Nobody knows. It's subjective. Economics is about, it's not a science because it's about human behavior, and humans are not robots. Human behavior is unpredictable. So in terms of how the Depression started, it depends on your political, well, political beliefs, but your economic beliefs as well. So liberal economists are in favor of more government intervention in the economy, more regulations, more government controls. And conservative economists are generally in favor of less government intervention, less government control of the economy. Okay. So the economy implodes during the Great Depression. Why did it happen? Well, liberal economists will argue that this disaster happens because there was not enough government regulation of the economy. There was not enough government control. Conservative economists will argue that it's the exact opposite. No, 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 no. This disaster happened because there was too much government control. So it's just in the eye of the beholder. Whyever it happens, it happens. And so here's the oversimplified way to picture this kind of spiral. Consumers have no money to spend. We have a consumer economy. Our economy depends in large part on people going out and spending money. Now, let's just think of a very basic, small level example here. Consumers have no money to spend. There's 10 people who work at a factory and the factory goes out of business. Those 10 people are consumers. We're all consumers. We all spend money, right? If people lose their jobs, they're not going to be spending as much money. Duh. They don't have money to spend. And even if they do have some savings or whatever, they will decrease their spending. They're going to be only spending on essentials, generally speaking, right? So let's say 10 people get fired from the factory. That's consumers have no money to spend. Next, suppliers cut prices because of low demand. Those 10 people that just got fired, they're not, in all likelihood, going to be going out to the movies, right? That's not an essential. Now, if those 10 people that just got fired are not going out to the movies, the movie theater in this example is the supplier. What are they going to do? No one's buying tickets to the movie. Well, they're going to need to cut prices. They're going to need to lower the price of what they're selling to try to get people to come buy the thing. Right? There's low demand for movie tickets in this example. That means the theaters are going to start slashing the prices for admission. Okay. The problem with that is if you cut the price too much, you're going to go out of business. Because however much you cut the price, you still need to pay your employees the same amount. You still need to pay your electric bill. You've already spent money to run the business. If you cut prices to try to get customers in the door, there is a point at which there's no profit left, there's no profit margin, and then you go out of business. So the movie theater goes out of business, for example, because the people that got fired from the factory stopped going to the movies. Then what? Now the death spiral starts taking over. What happens when the movie theater goes out of business? What happened to all the people who worked at the movie theater? Same thing as the people that worked at the factory. They lose their job, and now what do? Same thing the people that got fired from the factory do. They stop spending money. So now the people who worked at the movie theater, they stop going out to restaurants. You get it? And then what does the restaurant do? They start cutting their prices because of low demands, and eventually they cut the prices so much that they go out of business. And then everyone at the restaurant loses their job. And then what do? They stop spending money, and it becomes a death spiral. This is a timely issue as well. Um, 1 year into the Great Depression, Congress passed Smoot-Hawley tariff. Smoot-Hawley is just the name of the people, the Congress people that that passed this law. A tariff, you may have heard that in the news recently. Um, a tariff is a tax on imports. And the intention of tariffs is to convince slash force Americans to buy things made in this country by taxing things that are made in other countries. So let me walk you through a quick oversimplified example. Um, most things made at Walmart, or most things at Walmart, on sale at Walmart, are made in China, as you know. A lot of our consumer products are made in China. Okay. Why? Well, because things made in China are cheaper than things made in the US. Because China has a much lower cost of labor. Chinese workers are paid far less than American workers. That enables Chinese companies to produce products, ship them all the way over here, and still uh, sell them at a very low cost because the labor cost, which is added into the price of the final product, in the US, the lowest possible labor cost is $7.25 an hour. In China, it's probably 50 cents an hour. So if you pay your workers less to produce something, you can sell that thing for a very low price and still make a profit. So if you thought exercise, you go to Walmart, you need a t-shirt. There's two t-shirts next to each other. They're identical. They're the exact same products, same material, same quality, same everything. Two identical t-shirts side by side. One of them says made in China, $5. The one next to it says made in the US, $15. And that's because of the labor cost difference, right? In this example, this is not a trick question. Which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the cheaper one. If you have two identical products of the same quality and one of them's $5, one of them's 15, you're going to buy the $5 shirt. Okay. And in doing so, you just benefited the Chinese manufacturer. You're not going to buy the American shirt because it's more expensive. Why would you waste your money, right? And when you do that, you buy cheap imports from China, let's say, rather than an American made product. The what is fundamentally going to happen is in this example, the factory in America that makes those t-shirts, they're going to go out of business because no one's buying the shirts because they're too expensive. And all those American workers that worked in that factory are going to lose their job. How do we prevent that? One way to prevent it is tariffs. To stick with this example, we could say to China, when you ship t-shirts over here to sell them at Walmart, you can do that. But when that thing hits the shelf, our government is going to put a 300% tax on that shirt. Now that $5 shirt does not cost $5. Now it costs $20. You see where this is going? And now the American shopper at Walmart, same thought process. You got two shirts side by side. The American one is still $15, but the made in China shirt now is $20 because we put this huge tax on it. What is the intention of that tax? To artificially make the product made in another country more expensive than the product made here. What's the point? That will force the consumer, the shopper at Walmart, to buy the American made product. And when they buy the American made product, they have just protected the American worker, the American jobs. And that's sometimes called protectionism. That's the intention, protectionism. Protect American jobs by taxing stuff made elsewhere so that people will buy things made here. So the upside of that is we protect American jobs and we protect huge numbers of American workers from losing their jobs, which leads to all sorts of social dysfunction. What happens when people lose their jobs? Nothing good. Poverty, divorce, depression, drug abuse, uh, suicide, towns losing their tax revenue and not being able to pay for, you know, fire trucks. Nothing good happens when millions of Americans lose their jobs. But the downside to tariffs is it makes stuff more expensive. So the good thing about Walmart is that everything at Walmart is cheap, and that's great for the American shopper, especially for poor people. The downside is that comes at the cost of our middle class losing over the last few decades tens of millions of good jobs. So that's a very complex issue for you to think about. It's a big debate raging right now. We can protect our jobs in this country by taxing imports. We can. But the cost of that is things are more expensive. So very complex issue for you to think about. President Roosevelt was elected to respond to the Great Depression. He was elected about 3 years into it, 2 years into it. And he has three options. The conservative option, economically speaking, would be don't intervene. Let the economy recover naturally. Now, he wasn't going to do that because he wasn't a conservative. And even if he was politically, that wasn't really an option for him. He had to at least appear to be doing something. Do not intervene. Now, that might sound negligent and cold-hearted. I get that, but let me give you an example of this ideology. Um, Trying to think of an example that you would be familiar with. Toys R Us. That's recent enough, I think. Toys R Us, when I was a kid, Toys R Us, oh man, that's where it's at. Like that was a big moment in the life of a kid in the 1980s going to Toys R Us. Toys R Us went out of business, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago because, they can't compete with Amazon and whoever else. So Toys R Us went out of business. This is a small scale example of what happened with the Depression. Now, do not intervene might sound cruel, but let me ask you this. When Toys R Us went out of business, should the government have stepped in and given Toys R Us your tax dollars to save that company? Maybe. But if you say no, hey, sorry, Toys R Us, that's too bad, but I'm not going to pay tax dollars to save a business that went out of business. That's business, right? It happens. Well, that's the conservative argument. It's not the government's job to save businesses if they fail. Um, Kind of the middle path from his perspective would have been, well, I'm not going to do nothing. Um, Regulation. Let me go to the other extreme first. The conservative extreme is don't intervene in the economy. Let it correct itself. All the way at the other end of the spectrum is communism. Have the government do everything, government takeover. Roosevelt wasn't going to do either of those. He was going to try to do a middle path from his point of view, which is the government's going to do something, but we're not going to take over everything. We're going to try to set some regulations, set some guardrails. One example of government regulation is minimum wage, for example. Government intervening in the economy by saying, hey, we're not going to take over your business. That would be communism. But we are going to regulate your business. We are going to tell you, for example, you have to pay every employee at least this much money. Here's an example of some of the regulations that were done. Agriculture was in trouble. Farming, ranching. Um, and here's why, because all of this stuff is connected. Agriculture was in trouble. American farmers were in trouble because of World War One. During World War One, the huge majority of farmers in Europe were not producing food. Why? They were too busy killing each other in the war. They had been drafted into the armies. Make sense? So how are the Europeans going to supply their food when all of their farmers are now soldiers? They're going to get it from the United States. Because remember, for the majority of the war, we were not involved. So if you are a smart, ambitious American farmer, supply and demand, the demand for food in Europe is going up. If you're a smart American farmer, you might say, hey, I can meet that demand. I can meet that demand. And so you might, for example, borrow money to buy a new tractor, buy more land, hire more people to increase how much food you're producing. And for a couple years, you'd be making really good money. But then when the war ended, World War One ended, all the European farmers go back to being, they leave the army and go back to being farmers. Now they're producing enough food for themselves again. Now they don't need to be importing food from the United States, but the American farmers are out there now overproducing. You follow this? They racked up their supply, but now there's no demand for it because the Europeans don't need our supply anymore. So now the American farmers are producing too much food. And when the supply of something is very high, the price of it goes down, right? So American farmers were producing so much food that the price of, bacon was incredibly, incredibly low because there was too much supply. Okay. Cheap bacon. Sign me up. Sounds good, right? That is good because bacon's delicious, and when it's cheap, that makes it taste even better. That's good for the consumer, for the shopper. It's not good for the farmer because at a certain point, the cost of bacon in the store will be so low that the farmer's not making any profit, and the farmer goes out of business, and then no one has any bacon, and that's not good either. So American farmers were producing too much food, and the price of food was falling below a point where they can make any profit. What is the government going to do about that? Roosevelt says, all right, we're not going to do nothing. We're not just going to let it, we're not going to let our farms go out of business because then we'd all starve to death. And we're not going to do what Stalin would do and take over all the farms and starve millions of people. But let's find some regulation. So here's what they did. Government provided subsidies, that means tax money, to limit how much corn, wheat, cotton, etc., farmers are growing. The government said to the farmers, after you've grown a specific amount of corn, stop producing corn, and we will pay you to stop producing corn. Why? Because if the farmers reduced their supply, prices would increase. Supply goes down, demand goes up, price follows demand. How did they limit their supply? They slaughtered 6 million hogs. How do you limit the supply of bacon? Kill 6 million pigs and don't process them, just bury their corpses. Seems wasteful, no? But it fits the theory of supply and demand. Another way they limited supply was limiting how much land they were using. In return for withdrawing land, farmers receive, quote, rental payments from the government. Um, if you have a 20-acre farm, the government might say, hey, only grow food on 10 acres. So you're limiting the supply. And we will pay you to leave the other 10 acres empty. How do you limit the supply of cotton? They paid farmers to destroy 10 million acres of cotton. This worked. It stabilized the prices and kept farms from going out of business. Now, obviously, a lot of farms did go out of business, but the whole agricultural sector did not collapse. It might seem extreme, it might seem wasteful, might seem cruel if you're a fan of hogs. It worked. And if you understand supply and demand theory, this is a great example of that working. The Public Works Administration created more than 4 million jobs. This is a new government agency that hadn't existed before, that was created in response to this emergency. Jobs doing what? Repairing bridges, mostly infrastructure stuff, building highways, constructing public buildings. I don't know where you guys are from. I grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, and Providence, Rhode Island is one of those cities where the majority of public schools were built during this period by these types of programs. Okay. And I will say the schools and other public buildings, post offices, etc., the schools built during this period by the PWA, WPA, there were a bunch of these different agencies, but the schools built by New Deal programs during the Depression were and are beautiful. I'm talking granite, marble, oak, sculpture, columns, um, stained glass windows. I mean, the public schools built during the 1930s are beautiful buildings. Okay. Public schools built now are like just cubes of drywall and wall-to-wall carpeting and plastic. They're not exactly beautiful. And so this was about pride, basically. Building beautiful public buildings, building beautiful public parks, building new roads. Now, the conservative critique of these programs is the government can't, quote, create jobs. Because one thing is if you work for the government, where's your paycheck come from? It comes from taxpayers. Um, if the government says to you, we will pay you $30 an hour, and that money comes from someone else, right? It comes from taxes. We will pay you $30 an hour to dig a hole for 4 hours, and then to fill in that hole you just dug for another 4 hours. The government can, quote, create a job that doesn't do anything and just give you a paycheck. Um, so conservative economic theorists don't even like the idea that the government can create a job. They don't think that's the right word, create a job. But in this case, millions and millions of people who lost their jobs in private businesses and factories or whatever else went to work for the government under these programs. And you have to understand, economic theory doesn't matter to someone who can't feed their kids. So these programs were as much about pride and optimism as they were about, does this make economic sense? We'll get back to that in a couple minutes. The Social Security Act was introduced during the Depression, introduced a taxpayer-funded pension for Americans over 65. You've probably heard of Social Security. You all pay into it, whether you realize it or not. Um, Look, there was an emergency and, huge levels of unemployment and poverty. And this is one of the things that Roosevelt did under the New Deal to try to stabilize the situation. And one of the issues we have with Social Security now, so here's how it works in a nutshell. Every dollar you ever earn, 3.5% of it goes into the Social Security fund for you when you retire. But it's not your personal accounts, right? The money comes in the front door right out of your paycheck and immediately goes out the back door in the form of a Social Security check sent to grandma. So in other words, when Social Security started, people over 65 started getting checks right away, but they had never paid into the program because the program didn't exist. So when you get a Social Security check, you're getting someone else's money. It's not your own personal account. Um, One of the dangers with Social Security now, everyone knows it's going to collapse. It's a matter of when, unless something changes. Here's the flaw. Generally, you have to be over 65 to collect. Okay. When Social Security went into effect, life expectancy was a little bit less than 65 on average. That means, on average, the average American, I keep saying average, the average American would pay into Social Security their whole working life and probably be dead before they can start collecting a check. You see what I'm saying? Now, that might sound really cynical, but it's also a very smart way to construct a system that's going to last a very long time. So, what's the problem now? It's a good problem to have. Life expectancy has gone up radically. Life expectancy now in this country is very generally ballpark figure 80. So when Social Security programs started, the average American was going to pay in but never collect because they died before they were eligible. Now the average American is collecting for 15 years, right? So eventually it will run out of money unless we change one of two things. I think I've mentioned two numbers here, 3.5%. That's the tax, that's your Social Security tax, and 65. That's the retirement age. If you want this program to survive into the future, you will need to raise one of or both of those two numbers. You will need to say to people, starting now, we're not taking 3.5%, we're taking 5%. And or starting now, retirement age is not 65, it's 70. I kind of doubt either of those changes will be made because of the nature of our system, by which I mean, is anybody ever going to run for president, let's say, and say, vote for me, and I promise to raise your taxes and make you work longer? Is that a winning argument? And nobody's going to vote for that, even though we all know it's necessary. So, you guys are too young to be worrying about retirement, but I regret to inform you, you will be old someday, and it does matter, to say the least, whether we can save this program. The Supreme Court struck down several New Deal measures as unconstitutional. The New Deal, that's the blanket phrase for all of the programs Roosevelt was trying to do. So first of all, the Supreme Court, yeah, it did strike down not many, but some New Deal measures as unconstitutional. Right? Some things Roosevelt wanted to do, the Supreme Court said you can't do that. That's our system. That's what checks the power uh, of the executive branch. The Supreme Court can strike down and say you can't do that. Um, the textbook phrases it as so: the New Deal rested in the hands of a few elderly, conservative-minded judges. Well, okay, all the judges were elderly. Some of them were conservative-minded, and the author is upset about that. They don't seem upset about the elderly, liberal-minded judges, but that's fine. That just gives you a little insight into the point of view of the author. No problem. Liberal judges viewed the Constitution as a living document that had to be interpreted in the light of present conditions. We talked about this before, so I don't want to repeat myself, but just to remind you, this is a constant back and forth in legal circles. Liberal judges will say, hey, the Constitution is a living document. It has to be interpreted based on how things have changed, not based on what someone said in 1787. And conservatives are more strict constructionists. No, 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 no. It's not our job to interpret in light of, oh, now it means this. It's our job to read what was written on paper and apply it. So hopefully you remember that. We talked about that in an earlier context. Last thing in this unit, the New Deal addressed the Great Depression by restoring hope and promising security. It's a really, really good quote. Um, First of all, look at this mural. This mural would have been, in all likelihood, painted on the side of a building, probably by a government worker. So, should you be paying taxes in order for the government to hire people to paint murals? I don't know, maybe. Our friends, and it shows President Roosevelt. Do you want, need, or expect the President of the United States to be your friend? That's an interesting question for you to think about. I don't need the president to be my friends. I have my own friends. That's not the job, in my opinion. It's not the president's job to be my friend. It's the president's job, in my opinion, to keep us out of war if possible and set the conditions for a strong economy. That's the job, not to be my friend. But during this period, look, this guy got elected 4 times in a row, as you know. And here's the fascinating thing. The Depression didn't end. He got elected in 1932 to end the Depression. 1936, he runs for re-election. The Depression hadn't ended and in some ways was worse. 1940, he runs for a third term. He gets reelected again. Why? Because he ended the Depression with his policies? No, the Depression was still going. But people love this man. Because if you lost your job and you are terrified that you might not be able to feed your children, and you associate this man with the fact that you got hired to build a highway, build a school, whatever, you don't care about economic theory. You care that this man, what do they say? Restored hope. He did in the minds of millions and millions and millions of people, for sure. He restored hope, not prosperity, right? Very telling, but hope. And that's intangible. And he promised security. Did he restore prosperity? No, he restored hope. Did he provide security? I don't know. He promised it. It's a very telling quote. But this man was loved in a way that few, if any, presidents have been because of these psychological factors. Like all other major social transformations, the New Deal was criticized both by those who thought it did too much and those who believed it did too little. Also, really a good quote, something for you to think about. Look, in our system, the way our system works, nothing is going to satisfy everybody. It's not possible. And so, with anything the government does, some people are going to say it was too much. Some people are going to say it was too little. In the context of Roosevelt and the New Deal, people, conservatives thought it was too much. Like this guy is borderline communist. He's taking way too much power over the economy. And his liberal critics were saying he wasn't doing enough. He should have reached even further. And so maybe if you're getting criticized from both ends and you're right in the middle of that, maybe from a certain point of view, that's evidence that you're doing the right thing. If you're kind of in the middle of the two extremes from a certain point of view. All right, so that is it for the Great Depression, and up next will be World War II. And we'll see you then.